Sure.
Okay, do you just want to do this?
You'll need to be holding this.
Okay, if you guys are ready, I guess I'm ready too. Great. Yeah. Are we okay to go? Great. Okay. Hi, everybody. So the microphone makes this super weird and official, but thank you all for coming. Our committee is the Staff Development Committee for Technical Services, and this is our first event. We are going to be talking today about multi-campus operations for libraries. And we decided that this was an important first event to have in bringing speakers to come talk to everybody because of our recent move here, and of course because of our colleagues' soon-to-be recent move out here as well. And I think many of us know that when we were preparing to move out to 344, some of our colleagues visited both the New York Public Library and the Duke Library to get inspiration for the design and the construction of our building. So we thought as a committee, why not ask some representatives from these locations that inspired our current workspace to come and speak to us about challenges and opportunities about working in a multi-campus library. So today we have a few speakers for you. I swear the microphone is making me a little bit nervous. So we have a few speakers for you today, and I'll start over here with Meghan. Yes? Okay. Meghan Lyon is joining us from the Rubenstein Library at Duke University. Bill Stingone is joining us from the New York Public Library. Of course, we all know Matthew Beacom here from the Beinecke Library. And today we're being moderated by Marty Kurth, who is the Associate University Librarian for Technical Services at the university. And I guess I should just mention that this committee is made up of 5 members and the ex officio, and I think we're all here. I'm one of the co-chairs along with Matthew Mason, and Mark Custer is one of our committee members. Molly Bailey Dillon, who is in the Sterling Library, so she's with us on the video, the simulcast. Tom Bowles over here, and Matthew is our ex officio member. Okay, I hope I didn't forget anybody. Oh, yes, and me. My name is Jennifer Garcia, and I'm one of the co-chairs as well. All right, so I'm going to get away from this microphone now, and I'm going to hand it over to our moderator. No, I'm not. I'm going to hand it over to Matthew. All right. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Well, thanks very much, Jen, and welcome everyone who's here in the audience in this room at the Beinecke. We also have people at Sterling. I believe we have an audience at Walpole, and I imagine people are watching us streaming beyond in parts unknown. So welcome everyone. A couple of logistical comments. I will do my best to repeat questions from the audience. If I forget, please somebody wave your arms and remind me if I forget in the heat of the moment to do that. Likewise, we've set up for me to receive questions via email from the other sites too. So at some point I'll be kind of reaching down to my tablet and getting questions from there. The plan is, after I stop talking, to turn it over to our panelists for remarks that will start us off. Matthew's gonna start, and then Meghan, and then Bill. So we'll hold questions until each of them has had a chance to make their remarks, and then we'll open it up here, and I'll intersperse questions from the remote sites. So that's, I think, the plan. Does that sound good? Is that what everybody's
That sounds
good?
Marty.
Okay, great. And is that what you all who are here signed up for? Great, I'm seeing nods. So I will stop talking now and turn it over to Matthew.
Thank you, Marty. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming. I have just a few remarks to make at the beginning. I think this is basically my spin on what I see happening as we move out to this site. For me, the situation that we're in, being in this location and the rest of the library being in the original location, came about around the same time we were celebrating our 50th anniversary. At that time of celebration, we were talking about how wonderful that was and what a great 50 years that was, but we were thinking about how to set up the next 50 years. One part of how to set up that next 50 years had to do with the fact that our heating and air conditioning equipment and systems were 50 years old as well, and it was time to replace those. So that discussion of the HVAC equipment replacement led us to imagine what else we would do besides just replace the heating and air conditioning equipment. That led us to a moment where we imagined the Beinecke was empty and said, what would we bring back? What would we bring back first? And when we said imagine the Beinecke empty, we mean the building on Wall Street. We decided that the first thing that should come back is the readers to that site. And then we began to add in who else should follow the readers into that site. Access Services, I think, was the next group that came to mind for us. And as we repopulated that location with staff and services, it became clear that there wasn't enough space in that building for everyone. We already knew that because about 20 or 25% of the staff already didn't work in that building. We had people who worked in Sterling. We had people who worked at 121 Whitney Avenue. We had people who worked half-time out at the library shelving facility in Hamden. So though we often thought of ourselves as all working in the same space, about 25% of us worked someplace else. And we began to think about that and saw that this opportunity of replacing the heating and air conditioning equipment provided an opening to consolidate technical services and redesign the public experience of the building on Wall Street. So we moved from having 4 sites where we had public services staff to this one site where we have technical services staff. And as we began to do that, that project moved away from a heating and air conditioning project, replacement project. It moved away from a project to make some improvements to the reading room or to the classrooms or to the exhibit prep, and became a project to create a multi-site Beinecke library. And so we've created one site for researchers at Wall Street, one site for shelving at Leader Hill in Hamden, and one site for the technical services staff here on Winchester Avenue. And these 3 are the Beinecke Library now. The next piece of what I wanted to talk about is what I call mind the gap. So now Beinecke staff are divided half and half between the Wall Street location and the Winchester Avenue location. And the distance is about 1 mile. We can walk, bike, drive, or take a shuttle between the 2 locations. The good news is it's only a mile. The bad news is it is a mile. Sorry, I have to read, otherwise I'll take far too long. So how do we mind the gap? And for me, the gap issues are 3. There's a physical issue of moving people and materials among the 3 locations, across the gap. There's organizational issues. What new positions do we need? What new units do we need? What new workflows do we need? What new policies do we need? And then there's a cultural. With the gap, there comes a loss of immediacy. Even though we weren't all in that one space, many of us were, most of us were, and we were immediately adjacent to many of our colleagues and to the readers. So what had been implicit in that situation must now be explicit. What had been casual must now be formal. What had been unspoken must now be documented, and what had been close is now distant. Change is the the cliche is that change is hard. And part of what makes change hard is that change always means that we're losing something we've had. And dealing with loss is hard. And it may not be too much to say that we grieve for some of the things that we've lost. I used to ride on the bus every day for about 25 years with the same group of people to work. Now I have to make a special effort to ride once a week with the same group of people so that I get to have their company coming to work every week. The other part of change is the new. We have many responses to the new. We might be excited, we might be pleased, we might be afraid, we may doubt what's happening, we may have anxiety about it, but we may also have hope or optimism about the new. And we are now in the midst of a great change for us at work. And we grieve for our losses, and we navigate our responses to the new. And we use the change that we're creating to meet our ends. And at work, those ends are to make research possible. So let's spend the next hour or so minding the gap. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Megan's going to take the mic and the floor. So
Good morning.
Over to you, Meghan.
Yes, good morning. My name is Meghan Lyon, and I'm happy to be here, honored to be here representing Rubenstein. Thank you so much for inviting me. Just to give you a little bit of context about who I am and why I'm here, I work in the Technical Services Department of the Rubenstein Library. I've worked there for about 7 years. In my time there, I've advanced from being the tech services assistant to now I'm the section head for manuscript processing. And it's taken about 7 years. So in the 7 years that I've been there, I've seen a lot of changes at Rubenstein, just in the fact that they've just completed this past summer remodeling their on-campus library. When I started 7 years ago, I was 2 months into the move that tech services there went through to move into Smith Warehouse, which is an old tobacco warehouse in Durham. It's about 1 mile from the on-site library, the Rubenstein Library. It's technically on campus. There is shuttle service and that sort of thing, but it takes, a good 35 minutes to walk between my building and the library. Smith Warehouse is where the Rubenstein Technical Services operations are, but it's also where the Perkins Library, which is our general collections operations, is located there for tech services. And then there are a number of other Duke operations going on in that building. It seems very similar to what is planned for Winchester here. The difference is that Smith is designed to be a student space as well as a administrative space. The cashier's office is there, the visa services office is there, facilities is there, a number of operations with student programs are there, study abroad is there. That has all kind of developed in the past 7 years since we've moved there. The library was the first colonizer of Smith. And so I've seen a lot of changes in how the campus has adjusted to having more and more staff in this building that was really, it's been an evolution for us. So I'm hoping we can talk about that today. I wanted to also mention that because our library is just renovated, I think I might be able to speak to that as well, since that's currently ongoing here at Beinecke. The Rubenstein decided to completely empty out its building. We basically we gutted everything but the walls. The roof came off and we took it out. So all of the collections had to go. We had been in that building since 1920. There was a lot of legacy processes and piles and other things that we discovered in the process of moving out. And essentially, getting out was one step. Opening in a swing space was a second step. We relocated for about 3 years to a temporary reading room with temporary stacked space and continued to serve our researchers and students. And then we closed that space and moved back into the new space. To give you some perspective, I looked up some numbers. There's about 47,000 print and 11,700 manuscripts now on site. Our total collections are that's about 15% maybe of the whole collection. The rest of our materials are at a library service center, which sounds really similar to your LSF. So we're coordinating between the on-site stacks and getting used to that new space that we now have. Working at Smith Warehouse, which is where technical services has been for a long time, but we're still adjusting to the new building, just like everyone else who's now in the new building. And then, of course, our materials are not with us for the most part. Everything is offsite at this at the Library Service Center. So I can relate to a lot of situations that you're dealing with in a sounds like a slightly smaller scale, but we've been at it for 7 years now. So I look forward to talking with you more about different issues that you're facing, and I hope that I can get something too, because it's a process in terms of getting some ideas to take back to Duke. And I know that we're always interested in new ideas, and a lot of interesting things come out of Yale, so it's exciting to be here.
Thanks very much, Megan, and I will turn it over to Bill from NYPL.
Hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Stingone. I lead a relatively new organizational unit at NYPL called Special Collections. For the purpose of our discussions today, let's just call it Technical Services for Special Collections at NYPL. We could talk about the complexities of that as the day goes on. Just to give you some context, if you don't know this, NYPL consists of, I want to say, about 90 branch libraries and 4 research centers. Within those research centers, there's about 15 curatorial units that collect special collections, depending on how you define special collections, and that's another issue we're having to deal with. Most of the staff of this new unit called Special Collections is stationed at our Library Services Center in Long Island City, Queens, so that adds a 5th building to the equation for us. That Library Service Center was opened in April 2010, so we've been at it for a little over 5 years. And the creation of the facility was an outcome of a large-scale reorganization of the entire library. So for me, just to let you know in advance, it's very hard to disentangle questions about physical location and organization because of the fact that some of this physical location took place because of reorganization, and then in turn has perhaps catalyzed some other reorganizations that needed to happen over time. But it also could be the library just loves to reorganize itself, and that's just the context in which we live. I'm afraid I might be beginning to enjoy it too much myself. The most radical thing about that reorganization in 2007, 2008 was the formation of something that came to be known as book ops, which is combining the branch technical service with the research library technical service with the Brooklyn Public Library technical services. Yeah. They also were in the Library Service Center. I can't speak to their operations very much. It's very complex. If you've seen the video of the sorter, that distributes books all over New York City except for Queens, even though it's located in Queens. And they do amazing things. Book Ops does do some of the so-called, the cataloging of so-called general collections within the research libraries, and obviously special collections and that area of Book Ops has a pretty active dialogue going on about which departments take care of what. So Book Ops does not include archival processing, most special collection cataloging, depending on how you define it, preservation, or the management of special collections. Archival processing, special formats processing, which are 2 different units for reasons we could discuss later, and preservation are now the 3 basic areas that fall within special collections technical services. Most of these units were formed back during reorganization based on repurposing staff that were part of backlog projects, taking some staff out of curatorial units to more centralized processing, and many of those staff worked at the centers or at the library's annex. So you could say, in a sense, that when we moved to Long Island City, we actually created fewer satellite operations and staff than there were before. So it was a coming together in a sense. The library's conservation lab and its collections care unit also moved out to Long Island City in 2010. So briefly, just what we can get into what it all means later, but what we do is that we manage the acquisition, the processing, the preservation, and security. A special collection security is a new role for us, and we're still trying to figure out what that could mean, securing collections in a building that doesn't have any collections stored in it permanently, but obviously it's an administrative function. We process archives, catalog books, visual materials, audio, video, and even some stuffed animals. Basically, we do anything book ops won't. Our digital archivist and our forensic operations and our soon-to-be hired head of digital preservation will be based in Long Island City. Like I said, we have the conservation lab, the collections care unit, field services, preservation reformatting, and the registrar, some of which is based in Long Island City. So we have about 80 staff, 80% of which are in Long Island City. Most of the rest are at our Library for Performing Arts. Mostly it's people associated with audio moving image preservation because that's just where our labs were, and we hadn't moved them to Long Island City, and we still are considering whether we might or might not. Since this is being broadcast, I'm going to say right now we're leaning towards not. A few of us float between buildings, which is in a sense, especially for preservation, has always been part of the job, and more for our processing and cataloging staff make a lot more visits to curatorial units, go with them to evaluate new acquisitions for various reasons. And this is something that has actually increased since we've moved out of the building, oddly enough. We'll talk more about that later. Collections come in to us from the research centers, from our offsite storage facility, and increasingly directly from sellers and donors, though that's another issue about the curatorial comfort with that material coming directly to us as opposed to the curators for verification and inspection. A lot of our collections go to offsite after they are processed, but some go back to the research center. So it's managing that complexity of every single collection and where it came from and where it went is one of the challenges. We deal with a lot of material, not just for being processed for the first time, but when it needs to be reprocessed or prepared for digitization, prepared for exhibitions, and receiving conservation treatment. So there's several reasons that things could pass through our building. And some of them, like preparing large exhibitions. So you have material, hundreds of items from 42nd Street being moved to Long Island City to be prepared for an exhibition at 42nd Street. It can seem absurd at times. Conservation staff likes it. The registrar maybe not so much. We're just starting to plan and build our collection management and security function and decide, how it relates to acquisition administration and accessioning. But that's a relatively new thing. And as you imagine, having more and more meeting with curators, gathering 15 curators at one time who work at 3 different buildings is not always the simplest thing. But I will say in advance that for me especially, I think it's been interesting to see how us being slightly physically removed is able to sort of have meetings at sort of neutral sites or other sites and combine curators from different buildings that we might have not before. So we're trying more and more to work less with like, okay, today we're going to Performing Arts or today we're going to Schomburg, and more like holding a meeting at one of the buildings and asking curators to come from other buildings as well. Everyone's used to traveling in the library in general, but now we actually have increased the amount of traveling even more, but I think in the end it's essential and it's the reality we live in. So that's all I'll say for now. But I look forward to the conversations today because we haven't figured it out, so.
Great, thanks, Bill. Why don't you just hang on to the mic and we'll kind of see how it goes in terms of where the questions go. I think one of the, as I was listening too, it occurred to me that we need to make some room in the conversation for the panelists to ask one another questions too and to follow up. So we'll try to make some intellectual space for that as well. I think now we'll open up to the audience here at Beinecke, and while we're doing that, I'll also check to see if we have questions from the other sites. So any questions from the floor here?
Bill, you said you had 80 staff at the Long Island City Technical Services. What's total? Could you staff?
Sorry.
Let me repeat. So we're going to have to do repeat the question. So I'll try to do you justice, Amelia. You said you had 80 staff at the Long Island City location. What's the total staff among all the sites? Was that the question?
Sorry, I misspoke. It's 80 total about, and I say about only because we're in the process of several recruitments and someone's bound to be planning to leave. It's just law of averages.
It's life.
And about 60 are located in Queens.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Mostly for Bill, but I mean, if it applies also to Caroline's, that's fine. So traveling around New York can get expensive, and so how does that affect your staff and their want to move from place to place, particularly if the distance is going to suck up $5 every time they do it, that sort of thing.
Okay, I'll repeat the question again. This question was primarily for Bill, but others can jump in. The questioner observed that travel in New York can be expensive, and so how has that impacted the staff who could be faced with a $5 round trip cost to go from site to site on the MTA?
Not to contradict you, but actually traveling around New York could be cheap once you have a monthly Metro card, and that's 99% of the staff do, but it can be taxing, and traveling around on the subway, there's a rule in New York, it takes a half an hour to get every place, but it could take an hour, so some days you can whiz up to Harlem from Long Island City and feel like, wow, that's so easy, and other days it takes you, it ruins your entire day. So it's definitely a factor, but it's sort of it's been 5 years, and like I said, if anything, the travel is increasing. We're trying to get better at how we schedule it, but it is a constant challenge for the staff, as for everyone, and I would say our facility is quite nice. It's got good meeting rooms that are usually always available, but we still can't get the curators to come out there. It's just it's difficult for them, and so we do spend a lot of time traveling.
For a second part of that question, then would be, I mean, your time and your staff, your money you're spending on your staff in travel time could be pretty significant then. If someone's traveling 2 hours in a day to go to a meeting, that's 2 hours of work you're not getting out of them, really. Were those costs ever considered?
So
And in North Carolina, were those costs considered?
Yeah, so the question has to do with lost staff time with regard to travel. Was that factored in, calculated in any kind of way? And I'll mention too that we have a request from one of the remote sites that the speakers speak directly into the microphone.
You want to go first?
No, I was just going to say.
The cost and staff time. It's hard to say, only because the existing model before is not something I could even necessarily begin to describe to you. So it's different from here, for instance, that maybe the Beinecke was one building and now it's two. For us, we were 4 or 5 buildings, and now we're still 4 or 5 buildings. And I actually think that, in a sense, because staff now work, with people across multiple buildings, that in a sense, I mean, I don't know how to express this. They become slightly more effective in solving problems, not one curatorial unit at a time, and so it does. That's too neat an answer, but I think there is definitely an upside of meeting with 4 curatorial units and working on a problem, rather than meeting with the one that happens to be right outside your door, and then the other 3 are left without a solution or without even knowing they have a problem. So that's sort of the bigger picture. And I think people are just getting used to managing the time, and it's true. It does. I know for myself, days often get ruined just because you have a meeting right in the middle of the day with subway trips. But we don't think it's actually affected productivity adversely, and in some cases there's been a benefit.
Hi. So I think the way it's worked at Duke is we've evolved. Like when we first moved to Smith, I don't think anyone realized how challenging it would be to get back and forth for meetings between campuses. And part of it is that the campus has changed in the time that I've been there. But when we first moved to Smith, there was no bus service. The idea was that you walked to the closest bus stop and got on there. And it would take, you would need to plan in order to reach a meeting on West Campus, which is kind of what we refer to as the main campus for the library. I'm at Smith and they're at West is kind of just the geography in my head. You would need at least 30 minutes to catch the bus and get over there. And sometimes if the bus didn't come, you were going to be late. And it was this ongoing adjustment for everyone to accommodate that into their schedule and kind of make changes in the meeting schedules, but also like coordinate their time more efficiently now that we were in this offsite space. In the time that we've been at Smith, because more and more offices have moved to Smith, Duke has recognized that, oh, by the way, we should probably like help our staff get around campus, and so they've added a bus stop right outside of the building, which certainly helps. Unfortunately, that bus doesn't run all year round, so there's still like these adjustments in terms of if there's a class break or over the summer, the schedule is totally different for buses than it would be in the height of the semester. And then of course there's busier times of day and that sort of thing too. The students are on the buses just like we are. So all of that is to say, like, yes, staff time is, but we need to budget our time for transit. We do that in terms of getting to meetings that are on other campus, on the other campus. The question is, do I need to be there? Do I really need to go? And then, can we schedule it for a time that makes sense for the rest of my day? And the West Campus staff has been really accommodating for that because they recognize that we're coming to them. We also try to be even in our library. Our all library staff meetings alternate every month. We have one at West, and then the next one is at Smith, and the next one is at West, to give everyone a chance to take the buses around campus. One of the nice things about Smith is that parking is easier. There is no parking on the center of the campus, so it's not like I can just drive my own car and park, where I need to be. But it is great for the people at West who are trying to come over and review collections, or curators who are trying to schedule their time to work with tech services staff. They'll tend to do that either at the beginning or the end of the day because we have parking. So they can, get to where they need to be and then leave straight from Smith. And so that's been an adjustment as well in terms of they've adjusted their schedules just like we have. Does that answer some of your questions? Sure.
I have more, but I just don't want to dominate.
Sure.
While Megan's still, sorry, Matthew, let me just interject here. While Megan still has the microphone, we have a question that's somewhat related from the audience at the Sterling Library. And it has to do with what Bill had said about the idea that people were meeting in what is considered more of a neutral location, that it wasn't a hosting kind of a situation. Is the same true at Duke at all, where there's a sense that people are on more neutral ground? Or
They're really, I couldn't really think of a third location. Our meetings tend to be either at West or Smith, and that's just based on the bookable meeting rooms. I think at Smith we tend to go off campus more, and that's one of the benefits of where I work. We're closer to downtown. It's easier to go out to lunch and get to your car quickly, and that sort of thing is a real perk. That it takes much more effort for people at West to get to those opportunities. So I do want to mention that it's, I'm sure they didn't plan that when they moved to Smith, but it's really nice that we can do those things. But yeah, in terms of a third neutral location, for us, it just makes more sense to choose either one of the two facilities.
Thanks. And did you have a follow-up question, Bobby, before we? And I don't, because I don't want to Matthew to get too pent up while he's waiting.
I'll be okay.
Okay. All right. Good.
And I just wondered if either place has started doing more virtual meetings, or that sort of making use of technology.
Well, the question from Bobby here in the audience was whether staff had started making more use of virtual meetings and other technology, and that actually is a very similar question to one I got from Walpole, where they asked there whether folks were using Adobe Connect or other meeting technologies to facilitate discussions among staff in different buildings. So I'll, you want to start,
Sure,
and we
I'll
could
go
maybe
first,
work our way back with those related questions?
So yeah, a theme of I guess of my talk is there's been evolution, and that was the dream 7 years ago. and I just want to add, so when we moved to Smith, it was a very exciting time for tech services. It was not necessarily a voluntary choice, but part of the way that they kind of tempted staff to get on board with it was we had our own spaces that we were able to design, which that all happened. We have a really nice processing facility, great flexible workspaces there. Another perk was that we were going to have our own staff lounge with technology that would be possible to like Skype and have virtual meetings. We were also given an IT suite with computers to like do training and big computer related projects. We had extra storage. We had a kitchen. All of those things have since been like taken back from us in terms of the library has given back that space to the rest of the building for other administrative units to take over. So art and visual studies is in our kitchen now, and that sort of, it's not a kitchen anymore, but all of that kind of space was taken back. And as part of that, we lost a lot of the capabilities that, the dream was we would be in our staff lounge and, talking with the staff in the other lounge, and there's just not the space for that as it currently is. We lost it. So I would say that I think the idea is still, yes, it would make a lot of sense to have, these virtual meetings and that sort of thing. And I think we're at the point where our space is our space, and they can't take any more space at this point. They would actually have to move us again if they were to do that, which might happen, but I don't foresee it happening. And so now that we know like the boundaries of our space and the types of actual rooms we have available, we can start to think about like, well, if we wanted to turn this into a meeting room with technology. And now that the other end of the library, the Rubenstein library, is so up to date in terms of like every room in the new building is wired and capable of that. That was part of the issue too, is there was no one to talk to on the other end. It wasn't capable for that, but it is now. And I think that with that sort of opportunity is a chance to revisit those sorts of things in our space.
Yes, we do more conference calls than we used to. We don't necessarily, which is not necessarily a new technology. I should say our IT department is actually located on 20th Street in Manhattan, and they love conference calls because they don't want to leave 20th Street. But I shouldn't, partly because they would spend all of their time traveling. But we've been pulling back on that a little bit, partly because of some more recent changes and just building. I don't personally think, well, I succeed in building relationships on conference calls, and so. It's just, we do it when we have to, but we're trying to still move around as much as possible. And I should qualify something about my statement about a neutral site is that in certain departments leaving, say, the 42nd Street Library or the Performing Arts Library, then that turns meetings in those places into, not meetings at their library, but in one of the libraries that they serve or work with, and that's what I meant. So it's just a virtue of having four buildings that everyone becomes sort of. We're not the home team in any of them, which is sort of traditionally what would happen if you met with, say, conservation in 42nd Street, then they're still perceived as part of the 42nd Street Library and not part of the broader library, and that's one of the things that's changed. But we probably should use more technology to be more creative about meetings, because it could help. But I think part of it is, like you said, the technology and whether it's there in both places.
Matthew?
Well, one of the things I was going to say earlier was to ask basically the same question that Bobby asked, and but it strikes me that at Yale we're in a situation that's on the early side of the evolution that Duke has experienced, and we've talked about trying to mitigate the cost of traveling back and forth by using virtual technology for meetings. And that the request or the question that came over the email from Walpole's about 40 miles away, so they would be very interested in using technology that could close a gap of 40 miles. But we haven't made much progress with that. This meeting and similar meetings that have been happening where we simulcast or stream presentations or panel discussions is a step in that direction, but we have not done it where we're in one meeting room, in one building, in another meeting room, in a second building, and having one meeting at the same time together.
Thanks. Question from the audience here?
So this is a question for either of our visitors. How has the separation and being in different locations affected researchers? And I guess you have to then think about access services. I don't know what they're called, your respective institutions. And are there less opportunities for connecting staff to researchers, whether that was a way that was like structured and planned, or just also was serendipity that you grab an archivist to talk to a researcher, grab a curator to talk to a researcher? We have yet to see how that'll shake out, because even our readers are in this interim place. So yeah, if you could talk about that.
Okay, I'll do my best to repeat the question. And now I have to say too, it's getting a little eerie because I have basically the same question from from the Sterling Library. So the question has to do with impact on researchers' access, and also the previous experience where there were serendipitous encounters between staff and researchers who were on site concerning questions that they might have and specific materials. And you also had an access services aspect too. So would you restate that so I can work that into?
Well, just how this affects access services. So what may have been a quick question to go address a staff member is now an email and waiting for a response or a phone call. In a way, it's more work for access services to have this current setup, I think, but I don't know if that's the case. Okay,
and so the question was impact on access services, and also kind of the latency in terms of if a question comes in and it needs to be relayed to the other site and then come back, and what's been the impact there. And I see there's somebody from the audience that maybe wants to speak to the question too, or no. But let me fold in the remote question just so we kind of have all the questions on the floor. The remote question was, has there what has the impact been on researchers' access to materials, and have they noticed timing issues? So I guess this is that question about timing. Do you want to put a friendly amendment on the questions that are currently on the floor before I turn it over to the panelists?
Yeah, I don't want to make it too complicated, but I think collaboration with public services staff and your connection to public services functions and how you maintain that, or maybe there wasn't a change that you're about that.
So yes, the additional question has to do with collaboration with public services staff and what the impact has been there. So I guess the way I would frame it generally is, up to now we've been talking about the impact inside, for staff among themselves, and now we're starting to turn the questions out toward impact on researchers and users generally, and then how staff responds to that. So. Who wants to start?
The when we first made the transition, 2008, 2010, I mean, there was definitely more staff that had. So I'll look at it from the staff point of view, and obviously the impact on researchers, I think, should follow. There were more staff that were engaged in public service and technical services work, either within curatorial units or just generally, and that has slowly but surely decreased. Part of that has to do with the physical location. Part of that has to do with just the way we've started to restructure the way that we do work. The research centers are already also in the process of reorganizing and changing their public service models, and in a sense, our separation from that has made our life slightly easier. Now, what does it do for the researchers? I think I've always been a firm believer that, having an archivist available who processes a collection to help researchers using that collection is always a good thing, and maybe now we do it via email. But the reality has been, and it took me a long time, 20 years, to reach this conclusion, is that oftentimes the archivist who processes a collection doesn't work at the library anymore because we have 100 years worth of collection. So it's really not that often that that actually happens. We still try to make it happen when it's possible. And because more and more of our researchers are in contact with us in advance, we do try to distribute questions. At least some of our public service units are very good at, in fact, sometimes maybe too good at distributing questions to which archivist or cataloger might be able to answer it well. So it's still informal, and I'm looking forward to exploring those opportunities more. To be honest, public service leadership within the library is kind of distributed and dispersed, so that's another sort of mountain to climb. We don't think it's had a negative impact on the researchers as of yet, but that's a difficult thing to prove one way or the other. And in terms of access services more generally, that's one of the things we need to work out with respect to trying to get a better hand on collection management throughout the library, which is just, can we speed the delivery of things through better stacks management and things like that? But we're not even close to doing that. There's a whole nother aspect to that question, which I don't think we want to get to now, but maybe eventually, which is, what does that mean for the professional growth of some of the people who work in one place or the other? Because there isn't that sort of exposure that there might have been in the past. But I'll leave that for later.
Right. So to speak about are you talking more about the relationships between research services, which is, it sounds like that's what your access services might be, and technical services? The act of moving technical services away did make it much harder for us to, we had desk hours when we were on site, and at this point that's optional, and some of us still do it, and others of us, do it for a semester and then take a semester off, and it varies. That sort of cross training is much more difficult now. In terms of collaborating with people doing instruction or public programming, you really need to make more of an effort than I think it was before, when tech services was. We weren't in the basement; we were upstairs in these little squirrel away cubbies. But it was proximity. We were close, and there is no interaction in the hall unless somebody has traveled to West, and we still bump into each other in the hall, but it's not serendipitous anymore. I think that it took a little bit of time, but at this point it's working out really well for people who are doing instruction and doing reference, and our curators also do a lot of instruction as well, to bring in technical services, people who have maybe worked with the materials, recently, invite them to attend with the class and work with the class that's using the materials that they just cataloged or that sort of thing. That is happening. And it seems to be more of a shift in general to kind of bring tech services back in the loop a little bit, more than it has traditionally been. That I think is a shift in, like I said, in general, of opening the doors a little to who participates in instruction and who participates in reference. It's becoming much less siloed, because we all have knowledge and skills and background in different subjects and in different collections, and I think people are realizing that as they, just as the field changes, it doesn't need to be a reference archivist exclusively to work with a patron. So that, I think, is shifting, and it doesn't really relate explicitly to where we work. I think it's just a change in the field, at least at Duke. In terms of getting materials, we've always, at least in my time there's always been a delay in getting materials. The majority of the collections are off-site. So at this point, it's, if someone were to walk in the front door and ask for a thing that is not physically housed there, it wouldn't matter if it was at Smith or if it was at the Library Service Center. There would still be a delay in them getting that collection or that item. We've worked out a system where, we use Aon to track where things are, and we're working out a system to make sure that Smith Warehouse collection items that are in Smith are also tracked. So that's been a use of technology that seems to, it's continuously improving, but it's certainly better than before, where we weren't sure if it was in processing or on the shelf or something like that. So that's been a change that's made it a lot easier for people who are on point trying to help a person in front of them to know exactly where the item in question is. And then just in terms of interacting with patrons, a lot of it is now mediated through research services in terms of, tech services staff rely on research services staff to either pass on, sometimes there's errors or things that patrons find. All of that is kind of filtered through, the research services department. And also if there's, follow-up questions and that sort of thing, the staff on West can tell who's worked on the collection and kind of, but it's not like we go down the hall and see each other. It is just more through the internet or through a phone call, which is, nobody's upset when they get a call either. We all, the patron is our priority. So if there is somebody on site who needs us, just because we aren't upstairs doesn't mean that we don't, prioritize that interaction. So that hasn't changed. Does that help answer all of the various questions?
Matthew, did you want to chime in? And then I'll turn it over to you.
No, let's go to the next item.
Next question. Okay, yes.
I'm curious about getting the bills paid, where your business offices are located, and then the world of paperless, trying to use less paper. How does that how does that work? Where in our environment, in the business office, we get a lot of invoices. We got to pay people. Everybody has to get paid. So some departments email, but still that's still the culture of, I have this piece of paper, I have this invoice, here you go, pay it. As opposed to that, now we're going to be in different locations. How does that work? Where's your business office, and how does that work with this? I mean, how's it going?
So.
Let me repeat.
Okay.
So the question has to do with how interactions with business office works, how do bills get paid, where paper would have historically been passed from people in the same site, have we moved to paperless billing, email, just impact on making sure that people get paid when they'd like to get paid.
Right. The majority of our bill paying for collection materials is happening through our acquisitions department, which is, we have an order specialist for the Rubenstein, and he is in Smith with us. He's not technically a Rubenstein staff member, but we work very closely with him. So he is paying our bills essentially, and so we are physically next to him. The material is shipped to our building. All of our The policy at Rubenstein is that all collection material should come to Smith for ingest and acquisition and accessioning. It doesn't always work that way because donors will send stuff wherever they want, but that is what we try to encourage everyone to do, and that's certainly where all of our dealer and our purchase material come to that address, and as part of that process, he receives them at Smith. We make sure that it matches what we've agreed to pay for. The curators come to review it, and then the bills are paid that way. And we also order a lot of office supplies and archival supplies, and that sort of process also all comes to Smith, and then we disperse it. Occasionally, some materials need to go to West for work that might happen there. We have a business services professional who has a cubicle essentially at Smith for all of our travel, all of these archival supply purchases, basically anything non-collection related. And she has essentially at least once a week, she comes to Smith and reconciles there. So as part of our process, the receipts are, precious and locked away, and that sort of is formalized by giving her her own space in the bay, and she just comes and, keeps up with the books that way. So the two main people that we work with do it at Smith.
For non-collection material, the library, actually, we're pretty well taken care of in terms of the library's automated. Library uses Workday, and so we're able to instigate orders, process invoices, and it's all electronic, and it's a beautiful thing, except for, having to scan the packing slip when it comes in, and sort of that's very centralized. Collection material is a little more problematic, but that's partly because we're not sure how we want it to work, and there's also political dimensions of where material arrives and where invoices arrive and who gets to sign the invoice, and we're still working through those things, but it is a bit of a mess. And because there's the paying the bill, and then there's keeping a copy of the bill so that we will have known. So eventually it all gets to acquisitions, which of course is also in Long Island City, so that's because they're part of Book Op. So that's, it works, it's just the flow is not as regular and predictable as we might like.
I'll stay focused on collection material. Our finance department is temporarily housed in a third location, sort of in between the Wall Street and here. And they will go into the Wall Street building. They will return to the Wall Street building. I think that many of us have wished that we had put them here with us since we came out. But as we were talking in the tour today, the phrase that came up over and over is they were slightly smaller than we wanted to be for this space. They were slightly smaller than we wanted to be for this room, and everything is slightly smaller than we wanted to be. So I think that they were, there was just not enough space available in the footprint to include their work as well. One of the things that we're doing with paying the invoices is we're using a courier to deliver the invoices to the finance team, because we are concerned about, having multiple copies of the bill and not knowing whether you paid it or not. So we're using a courier to use paper versions of it. I think that we've changed our processes when we moved out here to adapt, and we'll probably be changing them again in a short time. So not till after they've moved back into the renovated building. And I see Sarah might have something to add.
I just have a follow-up question, actually, for Meghan, when you mentioned that materials are still misdirected to perhaps to the curator's specific office or somewhere else on campus. How do you, and then there's a more general question related to it, which is the secure transportation of special collections around different locations. And once something's in the library catalog, that's one question that actually, to be quite frank, Yale still hasn't quite solved in terms of special collections materials and rotating them across different repositories on campus. But prior to it even being in the system, we haven't paid for it, it's arrived. How does something that's been misdirected get to the acquisitions?
I'll do my best, Sarah, to repeat the question. So this had to do, it was a follow-up to something that Meghan had said about misdirected materials when I think Meghan's statement was that donors could send something anywhere. So if something doesn't go where we hoped it would go, how do people deal with getting to where it needs to go securely? And then you broaden the question generally with regard to safe and secure transport of materials. Specifically special collections materials. And there was an intellectual control aspect too that I want to weave in there if I can.
Yeah,
But
so something perhaps that belongs to the medical historical library that is needed for a researcher who's primarily doing their research in the manuscripts and archives department. And so kind of crossing repositories on campus, which may or may not apply to Duke, but perhaps applies to NYPL, maybe.
okay, so the related question again had to do with safe and secure transport of materials that might be needed, that are housed in one site, might be needed at another site. How do you make sure that things get where they're supposed to go? And that I think the related piece is that you know where something is at all times too. So Meghan, you want to start?
Yeah, so my theme has been, it has evolved over time. That definitely applies here. I think we're actually, I don't want to say we've solved it because I'll jinx us, but it's been going really well for about a year. And what we've ended up just doing is essentially if a collection comes in the mail to the wrong person, that person, first of all, alerts us that, oh, by the way, I have, a FedEx box of rare materials. And then we have tracking sheets and tracking systems. We use Google Sheets that are shared documents, but we also just physically have printed slips of paper that are color-coded depending on where they need to be. And every time things are shipped, the person sending it, like the sheet includes the person sending it, who it is for, where it is supposed to go, what time we have put it, out to be picked up by the shipping and receiving department. They initial it saying we have received it, and there's a couple of copies of those sheets, so it's the same information, just redundant. And we have found that this has worked for us. It's kind of low technology, actually, but the stuff is, then picked up by our shipping and receiving department. We have a library department that sole purpose is to transport materials, and it's not just special collections, but the majority of what the complicated things that they do, of course, are for special collections. They do our LSC run twice a day. And as part of that, they swing by Smith and then go to the LSC. And sometimes they're taking things from Smith to the LSC, and sometimes they're bringing things from the LSC to Smith. But then they also go to West. And that's how basically the things will make its way to Smith through that department. So when we're shipping special collection materials that are between Smith and Perkins, that was kind of our failure, our breakdown, and that's when we instituted these tracking sheets that essentially stay with the material at all times until they've reached the person that they are labeled to be for. That person is expecting them because of our Google Forms and our email system. Just this past week, I put something out to go over to our exhibits conservator who's preparing for an exhibit. We needed to fast track this collection of buttons for this case. They had just arrived, and so I put it out and I labeled the bin, and it got into the system, and I got an email yesterday saying, I did not receive this, where is it? It's because it didn't go to Rubenstein, it went straight to the exhibits coordinator, but because of that tracking sheet, we were able to figure out where did it go, and everything is okay. And we knew, first of all, that it hadn't reached where we thought it was going, so there was immediately a trigger in the system, and that worked really well. But yeah, since we've implemented that, we haven't lost things.
That's good news.
Yeah.
Moving things around securely is, I feel like that's all I think about lately. But in some ways, it's nothing new for us. But I think it's actually brought it to the surface. Us being out in this other facility. One of the really positive things that's happened in the last 6 months as we've made this slightly organizational transition is that we've had our registrar, preservation, and these two units that process and move a lot of material, including getting things from donors, working together. And we've just revamped, our 3 different ways of moving special collections material around, and levels of security and the different paperwork and systems that have to go with that. But I mean, it's a constant challenge, and it's but what that's then allowed, and even moving, as I walked around today, I couldn't help but thinking, well, how do you know when you have all these great rooms for specific purposes, so how do you know when something's moved from this room to that room to this room? And it's not a criticism, because that's what I'm thinking about every day. When something goes from archival processing to conservation, who's kept track of that? I mean, conservation has, archival processing has, but how do I know? Or how does so? And these are and then once you start adding the multiple buildings that then have multiple rooms within those buildings, I mean, obviously the whole thing starts to get quite complex. You add in our offsite storage facility, and so really, why the collections management function that we're trying to build is sort of looking at that more broadly, and because of the way the library has operated traditionally on this curatorial model, that even now there are lots of times when we call, when a collection goes dark, right? So often so we know about it as we're evaluating it, and then it gets received in a curatorial unit, and then sort of goes out of sight, except for the curatorial unit, and then it gets processed and it gets sent back, and then it kind of goes out of sight. So this is what we're trying to alleviate without, while still respecting, dealing with the stack spaces we have, respecting the curatorial expertise and their desire to be involved in certain aspects of collection management and acquisitions, but we just need to figure it out. But we have lost things, and often found them, but so for reasons you might read about in the paper or have already, we're paying extra attention to collection security right now.
So one of the first things that we did when we began thinking about this move was to think about the movement of material, and we've already had a lot of experience moving material because of our experience with the library shelving facility. So what we did was we took one of our smallest units in tech services, which was our preservation officer, and she had recently picked up the responsibilities for a registrar for the loans. We used to say that we don't do any loans, and then we did loans. And we learned to admit that we do loans, and let's have a formal process. Let's have someone responsible for it. She became the head of that. We added another person who was doing movement of material work in the manuscript unit to this preservation registrar unit, which is now preservation and collection management, and they have the responsibility for tracking all the movement of the material throughout, and the staff, the responsibility for charging out the material as it moves from one activity to another, one space to another, is distributed to the staff that is working on that movement, and to a large extent we're using Aon for that. One of the things that we also do is, as we moved out here, and this speaks to a bit of that change between the informal and the formal and the implicit and the explicit that I mentioned earlier, that all collection materials should come to this location to be received. And none of it should come to either any of the temporary spaces or to the original space when it's reopened. This is where we have our loading dock. This is where we have our receiving room. We'll take physical and intellectual control of it in the receiving room, and that requirement really forces the curators to come to the LAR location. And I think that was really seen by everyone, perhaps reluctantly by some, that to be a necessary part of having control, and part of our experience moving out of the original building on Wall Street is that there was a lot of material in the curator's offices that needed to be brought under control toward the end of the move, and then moved into a secured location while their offices were destroyed during the construction process.
We've got a follow-up question for Meghan from the folks at the Lewis Walpole Library on the same topic. Meghan, did you explore using Aon for the routing challenges that you mentioned instead of the paper sheets?
Right. I should add that, I think we're happy with how it's working, but it's not the most efficient process. And we do have Aon in place at our library. And so I think the next step for us is to implement Aon for materials leaving West. We don't reliably use it at this point because we're right now, Aon gets one-way messages from GFA, which is what our Library Service Center software uses to track materials. And so it would take a bit of a change in our workflow to make sure that materials coming from the LSC to West and materials coming from the LSC to Smith, we just need to revisit those workflows to get it all in Aon. But I do think that is the future. It has not been fully implemented yet. We do use Aon for all movement of materials at West, whether they're in the reading room, going to exhibit, going to our conservation department, which is at West, going up on the wall, leaving the building. We also have agreed to formally loan. So that's been a change for us too, to start more formally documenting that. And all of that is currently done through Aon. So we haven't quite folded in tech services processing into Aon, but I do think that will happen.
Thanks. Jen?
When our Beinecke reopens, many of us, well, I don't think any of tech services is moving back, but many of us in tech services won't really have a reason to go to the Beinecke because we're not involved with meetings and we're not involved with interacting with researchers. So I'm wondering, when you made your transition, and Bill, I know your situation is a little bit different because you were already in different locations, but I'm wondering, how did your staff adjust to feeling like they were still connected to a library where they were not working in? And related to that, how did you all adjust to sort of the interpersonal relationships among staff that you don't see hardly ever?
So the question has to do with, and using the specific case of the Beinecke as an example, when the Beinecke building on Wall Street reopens, the staff who are here at this facility in tech services won't have the same kind of reasons to go there that they once would have done so. So how have staff dealt with that, and how has the institution dealt with that need? And there was a follow-on piece that I didn't quite get. So would you?
Yeah. So how has this affected interpersonal relationships amongst staff that are in multiple locations? How do you feel like one library when you don't work in that library anymore, and when you don't work with the people who make up that library?
So how is that fact affected interpersonal relations among staff, and how do staff continue to feel like they're part of one staff for one library?
I would say that this has evolved over time, and I'm sorry that's getting to be kind of my refrain. I really think that, at least for our library, it's been a matter of personal approach to that situation, because there are certainly people who, I work with at Smith who rarely, if ever, go to West because, they don't need to, and the materials, most of them are processors, and they, that's where their jobs are. I think in some ways Duke is different than Beinecke in that we are smaller, and so we have to work with each other more than it sounds like is necessary here in terms to actually get things done. There's just fewer people to consult with, so it kind of, that smaller staff requires us to rely more on each other. I think the act of moving brought our library together, because although I did not, I wasn't physically moving my office, I was involved in that move heavily, and everybody on the staff was required to participate, and it really kind of, for better or for worse, drew us together as a team. I know that it's an administrative goal to make us feel cohesive. That's part of the reason that all staff meetings are alternating locations, so that, whether we're meeting at Smith or meeting at West, like, we're all in one room, and that is essential, I think, for the kind of idea of the library, even though, like here, we aren't physically next to each other. Personally, I've handled it by, I choose events that interest me and I volunteer to help with them. I'm not currently on the desk, but I know that's how other people are staying connected to West. They have a regular desk shift. Occasionally, I'll call meetings with curators, and I do it at West so that I get out of my cube, even though I could make them come to me. I choose to go there because it's a chance to kind of run into people, like you said, who I wouldn't normally see. So those are some options that have, worked for me, and I know that may not be everyone's cup of tea, but it really is kind of about your approach to it in terms of, do you see it as a problem or do you see it as a opportunity to work in two spaces instead of one? And for me, it depends on the year or like the time of year. How hard is it to get there? That really comes down to the transportation options, or how hot it is outside, or how cold it is outside, and that kind of thing is perfectly acceptable at Rubenstein in terms of how people are feeling. Nobody takes offense at that sort of thing, but they also, at least at West, are incredibly welcoming to tech services, volunteering and like making the effort to go to West to, and attend an event. We've helped with exhibits occasionally. We help with public programming as available, and that gets us like back into the culture of West. On the flip side, we also, always welcome them to Smith when they are able to come. We've recently established like hotel space for them, and I saw that you all have that here. That's kind of, we've always wanted them to come, and we're making it, easier and easier for them to get work done there. So it's definitely a balance. I don't know if that helps at all, but it really is, it's what you make of it, at least at Rubenstein, in terms of how outgoing you feel like being.
I should say, I don't want to underestimate the traumatic nature of the transition for certain staff, or I should say the anticipation of the traumatic nature. It was a big adjustment for some people. But as you point out, that feeling of being related to the library, it's an especially complex one at NYPL, because it really depends on your point of view at any given moment. I don't know if you all have noticed this, but the outer boroughs in New York are becoming quite the thing. So one of the things I actually am worrying about is the Brooklyn, Queens, are we going to become this isolated, self-satisfied group of special collection hipsters who live a Manhattan-free life, which is, it's actually, everyone's great. I'd never have to go to Manhattan. It's fantastic. Midtown. Who goes to Midtown? If you didn't have to, you probably wouldn't. But on the other hand, it's still, so if anything, it's pushing them, not that they feel alienated, but to make sure that they don't actually alienate themselves, and sort of, because now that we're all working together in ways we never have before, there is a feel-good feeling, but there's a downside to that too. It's we work with all those other people too. But I actually do think, and this sounds too optimistic, you'll have to forgive me, because it's not like me at all, but I think what we've been able to do in coming together and actually in consolidating some of these functions in this staff out there and building, a pretty successful team, is that because of the work we're doing and accomplishing, we've actually, some of the staff, not all of them, have become more known to their colleagues than they were before. That's maybe very particular to our context, but I think that's the side of it. And yeah, there are more, maybe less informal relationships, but more, I shouldn't say that, but there are more presentations we try to make. And And actually, some of the staff has gone out of their ways and started organizing happy hours and things like that around the city, which frankly we never did before. And I think there's actually some more informal mixing than there used to be. So it's not about meeting casually in the hallway, but meeting even more casually after work. And maybe that's a generational thing. I don't know, but that's the way it seems to be going. So far so good. But yeah, it's always something we have to watch out for.
I think that I liked with Meghan when she said that it's a goal of the administration that everyone feel the oneness. Or you didn't say oneness, but
No, he said an enclave of self-satisfied hipsters.
that was the goal. I guess those. So you have the administrative goal of feeling coherent, cohesive, feeling connected, and that's really true. And I think that, but the other thing that I picked up from Meghan was that so much of making that happen is driven by the personal choices of the individual. And I think that to realize that a lot of it will happen because of the personal choices of the individual is an important thing to keep in mind. But that administrative goal to have us feel like we're all part of the same library, that it's all Beinecke Library, whichever the locations you're working at, has to be followed up by concrete actions that make it possible or that facilitate that personal choice on the one hand, or require certain interactions. So one of the things that we did was that choice of saying all material needs to come up here, all the new incoming material needs to come here, and all the curators need to sign off on it. Having reviewed it means that all the curators need to come here in order to do that. So that's a way of actually just building in a structure where you're forcing people to take action. That's one example. I can't think of any other where we're actually forcing people to do something like that by class. But we're trying to create opportunities for people to be more engaged, not only the professionals, but the C&T, the unionized staff, to be engaged with reader support work, classroom support work, the other work that's happening or will be happening again back on Wall Street. That's difficult to manage in lots of ways. It creates an administrative burden on access services. It creates an administrative burden on technical services. Time spent away from your duties at technical services mean that your productivity as a technical services worker will suffer because you're spending that time in some other activity. But it doesn't mean that your overall productivity suffers, because it's just that you've relocated some of that production to another activity that's about making research possible at the Beinecke. I don't think that we're too much in danger of becoming an enclave of hipsters in Science Park, but this is the first time that the whole of technical services has been together in the same place. So we had 3 different locations for our technical services staff. 10 of us used to not be part of the organization, but were related to it, and they were part of tech services for a while, for 50 years. And only 1 year ago did the rare book catalogers become part of Beinecke. They were actually part of the main library, and they only worked on Beinecke material, but they weren't part of the Beinecke. It was a strange half relationship that people experienced for a long time. And then the co-location of us with preservation and the co-location of us with YUL Technical Services will create the largest group of librarians on campus. So there'll be about 140, 120 of us, something like that. I don't know what the final counts will be. But that creates a sort of a large enough mass to become an attractive force on its own. And we're trying through this program that this is a representative of, the first instance of, trying to create opportunities that will draw people here, either physically or virtually through the camera technology. So we're working on that, and I think that it's going to be an evolution.
I've got a follow-up question from the people at the Sterling Memorial Library for Meghan and Bill. How do the Rubenstein and NYPL include their support staff in the efforts to promote cohesiveness among staff?
I think support staff at Duke, although it is there, it's there in name only in terms of we are all colleagues, and I feel like I'm allowed to say that, having my initial role was paraprofessional, and I have since been promoted to professional, and so I feel like I can kind of speak from both sides of that. There's not a lot of distinction between those roles, and that can be good or bad depending on your outlook and your goals. So that's a different conversation. But the main motivations of both types of staff are the same, and they work together. You know, it doesn't matter in terms of the work that we're doing. So I'm not sure that it really would be relevant to maybe how the situation is here.
Yeah, I didn't mean to pass the mic because I didn't want to answer this. We're pretty light on support staff, and I think in the same way, and that's another discussion about whether we're configured correctly, but and most of the support staff has been around for a while, and it's hardly discernible, you know, whether they're support or not. Yeah, so they're involved in all the things and all the discussions in many cases that the professional staff is as well. And that's why we're in no imminent danger of becoming an enclave of self-satisfaction. I might have overestimated that.
Well, I think in the interest of being stewards of the time, the session was scheduled until 11:30. So by way of wrapping up, I just want to thank the Beinecke Staff Development Committee for doing such a terrific job with this event. I think it's that they really tapped into a topic that's obviously of interest to us, but it's part of, you know, the contemporary, you know, era of library history, you know, and so it's an important conversation to have, and it's especially good to see people in different stages of all this. And to take a historical perspective, I couldn't help but notice that, you know, here we're in, you know, former manufacturing site, firearms, and you know, I don't know what was going on in Long Island City, but you know, so tobacco manufacturing. All we need is alcohol in Long Island City, or but parking lot. But it's part of, you know, it's part of a larger history too of, you know, the move from, you know, manufacturing to a different kind of, you know, more white collar service oriented, you know, evolution of work in the United States. But anyway, so it's a really good work that the committee has done in pulling these folks together. So I would like us all to thank them and to thank our panelists.
Thank you, Marty.
Mm-hmm. You bet.